The first disability category we'll talk about is the emotional and behavior disorders. And I picked it first because this is really my specialty. When I was a student teacher, I taught in psychiatric hospitals. And so with state licensing as it was in the 90s, my master's degree was specifically towards a license in emotional and behavior disorders. So that's the only reason we picked it to go first. So we'll start with a little bit of history of the term. If you look at things that are being written about students with emotional or behavioral needs today, the term you're going to see is E/BD, emotional/behavior disorders. And the reason that we see that language is when special ed law was reauthorized the last time in 2004, the category name for these students shifted from behavioral disorders to emotional disturbances. And this was a big shift. It doesn't maybe seem like much conceptually, but in practice it was really a big deal. And what the Congress was saying in making this switch was that those students with behavior disorders, they were saying that behavior is a choice, and so we shouldn't provide special ed services to students that are making poor choices. And that was the switch to emotional disturbances. Now, those of us in the field, we look at what Congress is saying, that behavior is a choice. Those of us who have worked with students with really severe behavioral needs, and we know that that's not true, right? That I chose what I was going to wear today is not the same choice that a student who really struggles with behavioral needs. It's not making a cut and dry choice, like what to have for lunch or what clothes to wear. And so the field is taken to considering the term in fullness by saying emotional/behavior disorders. So just a little technical distinction in how we conceive of a label for these students. And that's kind of the history of the term. When we think about the characteristics of the students that are included under this category, there's not a consistent definition state to state. And actually, if you look at a lot of textbooks that try to talk about a definition for emotional and behavior disorders, you'll see a column of 3 terms. And the sort of joke is you pick one term from each column, and if you do that 50 times, then you have the definition for all 50 states. And so there's a lot of variation in how these students are considered at the state level. In my practice, I've always kind of divided these students into 2 categories. In one category, I talk about the students with conduct issues. So this would be someone with oppositional defiance disorder, a conduct disorder. And then on the other hand, I used to refer to these as the organic disorders, but it doesn't have anything to do with where your avocado was grown. And so now I talk about the students with emotional concerns. So we have our students with behavior concerns, our students with emotional concerns. Both of these types of students are being identified for services. And they really need something completely different as it relates to the kinds of services and the kind of classroom we would set up to serve them. So if you're in a general ed classroom and you have one student with either of these concerns in your class, it's pretty easy to accommodate for them. But in my work, if I had 10 students, 5 with each of these needs, that became a real challenge. And so if I'm working with a student with a conduct disorder, with a real behavioral disorder, the type of classroom that I try to set up is one where I, as the teacher, am sort of the smallest authority I can possibly be. Because a student with those disorders is naturally going to react negatively to authority. And so how, as a teacher, can I remove myself from that place of authority? One of the ways that I tried to do that was to give students a lot of agency over the classroom. I used to use the term control, and then I read C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape's Letters, so I just try not to use control anymore. And so by agency, I mean that the student is empowered to make choices over how their day is going to go. And this isn't always possible in a general ed classroom with 20 or 25 other students, but I think it's something to think about. And so every Monday morning when the students came to school, they got a clipboard. And on that clipboard was everything that they needed to do academically for the entire week. Now remember, my students were spending half of the day in the classroom and half the day in psychosocial therapy. And so this was a little easier to do. And I had one group of students in the morning and one group of students in the afternoon, and they switched. So everybody had a clipboard. The clipboard had all of their academic assignments on it. And we had a schedule like any other school, right? That, first period may have been language arts and second period would have been math. But the students then had the ability to choose when they completed their work. And so if one student hated math and wanted to do it all on Monday to get it out of the way, or more likely save it all for Friday, they were free to do that. And instead of delivering whole group instruction, I became the facilitator. And so I sort of worked with students one-on-one, more like a tutor than a teacher, which took me out of that role. These classrooms need to be predictive, and so if things are going to change, I want to talk about those changes with the students. I want to present things to them as choices, not as dictates. And all in all, that turning over the agency to the students in a controlled way, it wasn't chaos, allowed those students more structure in sort of a less structured way. I know that's counterintuitive, but it created more comfort for those students and then a baseline to build from. The opposite would be true of those students that I would classify as having emotional issues. The classroom for those students needed to be highly structured, highly prescribed, and highly dependable. And even my attitude as a teacher would become different because with those students, they needed that predictability. I remember in my first or second year of teaching, I was working in a psychiatric hospital and the students wore uniforms, a khaki pants and a blue polo shirt. And they got upset one day, or one of them got upset and said, well, you can just come in here wearing whatever you want every day, and I have to wear the same old thing every day. And so that's when I decided that I was going to wear a uniform. And so I went to the store that night. They wore white polo shirts, or blue polo shirts. I bought 5 white polo shirts. I also wore khaki pants. And one of the things that I'd read at that time is the more consistent you are in the classroom, the more structure that you can create. And so I took that consistency all the way to my wardrobe, that I showed up looking the same every day, that was something that was predictable for those students. When I was a principal, I would bribe the man that was in charge of sort of the physical plant and the grounds with a box of donuts to tell me when the surprise fire drills were going to happen. Because there were certain students in certain classrooms who 2 weeks ahead of the fire drill, I really needed to start talking about, okay, we're going to have a loud noise next Tuesday morning. It's going to be the fire drill. It's come and be prepared for it. Because that level of structure and that level of consistency was necessary. Literally, one disruption of like that could sort of tank the rest of the day. So both groups of students need a little something different. One needs the authority to sort of shrink out of the classroom. The other person needs to trust the authority and being able to rely on the structure and the consistency of the authority. So that's kind of the history, or the most recent history of the term, what emotional and behavior disturbances means, kind of the two groups that we can put students in, those students with conduct disorders, those students with emotional illness, and then how their needs differ. We'll talk more about these students as we move forward.